Hi, Jeff Spira here again, and today I'm going to roll the clock back to 219 BC, and we're going to roll it back to China. China at the time, there was a series of long wars going on about that time through the districts and states and what's now China. And a great leader finally conquered the less powerful neighbors there, and through technological innovation, really, in warfare, using new weapons and tactics. And they were the first to use horse-mounted cavalry, for instance, to fight wars. He combined some of these smaller fiefdoms that were going on there at the time. And he unified China into a state in 221 BC. And this is kind of referred to as the Qin Dynasty, which is actually the term where China comes from. The term China comes from, it's the root of the word. So his name was Emperor Ch'in Shih Huang. So that Qin is what became again China. So Ch'in Shih Huang. He was a young man when he took over. He survived a number of wars and several assassination attempts, and pretty soon he had kind of become quite a megalomaniac. He had no more lands to conquer. He owned it all, and his dictatorship was very stable. So he started to have an obsession, which is what some Chinese tales were about, and it was about immortality. So this was really the Chinese classical period. This is the time when Lao Tzu, the author of Tao Te Ching, the founder of the Taoist movement in China, it continues this day. So. And a contemporary of Lao Tzu, of course, was Confucius, whose name I'm sure you heard. His philosophies spread throughout the empire in that area too. So, and the whole concept of legalism and having legal laws and things originated in this period. So, it was a time of great thinking and a lot of religious awakening in China. Eastern thought in religions really is less concerned with mysticism and dogma and resulting in success in the afterlife, and it's more about here today. So how to improve one's lot in life today. So Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism are all geared to activities to improve this life today. So. Rather than sacrificing for some promised future. The religions of the times were really considered usable knowledge that was workable. So one of the Taoist beliefs was immortality, and to achieve it, one had to journey to the Blessed Isles, called Peng Lai, where one could go find an elixir for immortality. This was considered to be a real location, not just a metaphor for a particular state of mind or anything like that. But many Chinese explorers set out to find these isles, and the vast majority just never returned. So there was a lot of stories about Peng Lai, the Blessed Isles, where you could find the elixir of immortality. So. And it was it could have been fueled by there's a anomaly along the eastern seaboard of China that causes mirages to appear at sea. It's kind of like looking at islands, but I don't know if you've ever driven through the hot summer day and you see it looks like there's islands on the highway, as the road lifts, the hot air lifts the air, and you kind of get that mirage at that. So, these islands were always out of reach or just simply vanished as sailors set out to discover their secrets. So this emperor Ch'in Shih Huang simply had to have this elixir, and he really wanted some of it. So he organized a large expedition and assigned the task of locating this secret of immortality to a knowledgeable sailor and navigator, and his name was Hsu Fu. Hsu Fu. He set sail to the great unknown sea in 219 BC. One of the greatest historians of all time was Susuma Qian, sometimes spelled Qian. He was the emperor of the Han Dynasty some 140 years later, after the Qin Dynasty. And he it was about 90 BC, so it was just quite a while later, to assemble a complete historical record of the Chinese nation and peoples. And Qian wrote about Hsu Fu. After being gone for a number of months, he returned to China and told of meeting with a great sea god. So, sometimes translated as a dragon god, who led him to 3 islands protected by a fiery monster and offered to show him the elixir of immortality. But he couldn't take any of it at the time, nor could he leave with any of it. It had to stay there. But if Hsu Fu returned with 3,000 young men and virgins, he could trade the elixir for these people. So he went back to China went back to this Qin emperor and assembled a fleet of ships and took 3,000 young people and sailed off to the Pacific, never to be seen again. So Qin goes on to say that Hsu Fu found a fertile plain in a distant land, which he populated with these 3,000 young people and set himself up as king of the new land. So now, historically, people think that Hsu Fu sailed to Japan. You know, when viewed from the seaside of Japan, the side facing China, only 3 of Japan's 4 main islands are visible. You know, Hokkaido, Honshu, and Kyushu. The 4th one is Shikoku, and it's kind of on the east coast of Japan, and it's surrounded by the other islands. You couldn't really see it from China. So, Japan's known for its geologic activity, like earthquakes and volcanoes are common. So, you know, could volcanoes undersea or on an offshore island had been the fiery monsters Hsu Fu protected the Blessed Isles with? And it's possible, you know, that's a possible thing that could have happened. And there's actually a shrine in Shingu, Japan, dedicated to Hsu Fu. Shingu is a port city on the plain of the western coast of the southernmost island in Japan. That's Kyushu. And it's not far from the modern city of Fukuoka. And it's a likely landing spot that Hsu could have landed. You know, if you go down current from the Canton coast, where Hsu Fu expedition would have launched, you could sail there pretty easily to that area of Japan. So. Some even claim that the first emperor of Japan, Jimmu Tenno, was in fact Hsu Fu, from the similarities in legend, descending from the sun goddess and living in a fertile plain and moving easterly and eventually becoming emperor of Japan. But the dates don't coincide very well. You know, according to Japanese legend, Jimmu Tenno was born about 711 BC, you know. And the Meiji Emperor of Japan declared 660 BC to be the founding day of Japan when Jimmu Tenno became emperor. So that would put Jimmu Tenno about 150 years older than Hsu Fu. So the big question is, could the Blessed Isles have been past Japan, all the way maybe to the west coast of America? You know, Japan was not unknown to China in about 200 BC. You know, there must have been contact between China and Japan at the time, since the Yayoi people of Japan, the ancestors of the modern Chinese, who had displaced the Jomon in about 1000 BC, were racially Chinese. They were Han Chinese rather than Polynesian origin of the Jomon, that lived there at the time. It's possible it could have begun with a lost fisherman blown out to sea, since many of the Yayoi were primitive, but by Hsu Fu's time, Japan had a writing system, which was really Chinese kanji, organized government, silk garments, and many of the other trappings of the Chinese society at the time. In the U.S., there's the Smithsonian Institute, for instance, had archaeologists checking out some of this information. There was one named Emilio Estrada, and a really famous archaeologist named Betty Meggers, and they think Hsu Fu, or at least a Chinese expedition, could have made it across the Pacific to settle on a fertile plain, not in Japan, but in Ecuador, which sounds funny. They claim that there was a sudden appearance of carved jade artifacts, which the people of the time in Ecuador did not carve jade. They just didn't do it. There were lacquer techniques that they found, and ceramic pottery that presented a very, very strong case for Chinese influence along the coast of Ecuador. These artistic methods and technologies show gradual development over centuries in China, but they suddenly appear in Ecuador as advanced techniques without any evidence of any archaeological development. So they could not have suddenly just appeared on the coast of Ecuador. They must have been brought from somewhere. And the most logical place, of course, is China. So other artifacts were identified by Estrada and Meggers, like its home architecture and its construction, net sinkers used in fishing nets, and the coolie yoke, a method for a person to efficiently haul loads with ropes. I'm sure you've seen the coolie yoke in some of the old movies where they talk about working on the railroad or whatever. They had a special method of doing that, and that was a Chinese method. So distinctively Chinese origin. And more evidence appears because a number of intestinal parasites found in burial sites throughout South America. There's hookworms, hairworms, whipworms, and the giant roundworm of Asiatic origins have been discovered in South America, dating as far back as a couple centuries BC. Because these are tropical parasites, they only occur in warm weather. They have no ability to survive in cold climates. They couldn't have survived an overland passage north through China, across the Bering Sea, south through Alaska and all that. So the only possible way for them to come to South America is from Asia, was in the bodies of people making ocean voyages. That's the only way they could get there. So that's a pretty interesting piece of evidence that traces it back to 200 BC or so. There's an earlier situation that occurred that I'm going to talk about in another video. That Tim Severin, who's a sailor, and he does some of these antique voyages. He demonstrated that a bamboo raft had the distinct possibility of journeying from Asia to the Americas. But Chinese shipbuilding at that point, the time Hsu Fu had progressed, was way beyond latching together buoyant bamboo poles. It was they had ships of substantial size and seagoing capabilities at the time. There was a lot of sailing ships that showed sails and more or less stern-mounted rudders and other things that can be found on Qin Dynasty artwork. So they had adequate ships to make the voyage. In 90 BC, Sima Qian, the great historian, wrote that the Qin emperor assembled a fleet of Lao Chuan, which are really castle ships. They were warships with protective parapets on the deck. So and they used an amphibious assault in the Chu state. So that they had the ability to build some pretty spectacular sailing ships at the time. So the junks of that time were flat bottom, had 2 or 3 masts, pretty similar to Chinese junks of today. They're very seaworthy and capable of traveling in the open ocean well. So the ships are fairly light and flexible, and so they have ability to flex to the passing sea rather than resist the forces like some of the European oak ships were. So they allowed lighter craft to handle rougher weather than the European counterparts. In 1974, there were some archaeological digs in Canton that unearthed Qin Dynasty Shipyard. And they had constructed vessels as large as 30 meters long, which is 98 feet long, and 8 meters in beam, that's a 26-foot beam, displacing over 60 tons. These are larger than Columbus's ships. On the Nina and the Pinta were a lot smaller displacement than those. So there's little doubt that the Chinese junks were capable of ocean passages. Many people, even these days, would say that the junk designs were far more seaworthy than Columbus's ships. China was also home to the magnetic compass. Evidence of a knowledge of the Earth's magnetic fields, homes built with precise alignments to the poles, go back many hundreds, perhaps thousands of years before the Qin era. So by the Qin time, compasses were well known, especially among sailors at the time. The Chinese compass looks like a spoon, and it references in literature all talk about the spoon that points north. That's a reference to the Chinese compasses used on ships. The Japanese knew about them as well. They had Chinese compasses, so they understood navigation. So they had a knowledge. The ancient Chinese had a knowledge of latitude and longitude, and not only that, but they had accurate measuring methods to determine them. So they certainly knew the Earth was spherical, and studies of ancient ships reveal a sophisticated knowledge of spherical geometry, which is what's kind of necessary to understand your location around the surface of a sphere, which is the surface of the Earth. So it was much more accurate than the Western methods of the time. So they had angular measuring instruments as well, identified in the Qin Dynasty. The ability to celestially navigate was not only possible, but is very highly probable. The way the Chinese did it. There was a scientist named Joseph Needham, and he presented one of the real astounding pieces of evidence based on a 200 BC contact between the Chinese and ancient Americans. He noticed that the mathematical calculations used by the Han Dynasty Chinese, which was 206 to 220 AD, and the Olmecs of Mexico, which is 300 BC to 800 AD, to calculate the future eclipses of the sun and the moon. They were identical calculations, and they could both do them. So another fascinating scientific similarity is the use of knotted strings to perform mathematical calculations. This is kind of the forerunner of the abacus, calculating method used in Asia even today. So in China, this device is known as a QP, or a QP. It's called back memorizing, a QP. So the Incas had a similar system, which they called QPUS. So almost the same word too. So the Incas used it for government transactions and for astronomical observations, and even coded communication messages that traveled long distances by messenger. So could this have been a coincidence? Well, it hardly seems likely. Two methods that are so closely aligned and having almost the same name. So let's go back to the voyage of Hsu Fu here. Now, why would he have possibly gone to Ecuador? That seems odd, doesn't it? It's nearly impossible to sail the Pacific from west to east, at least in the tropics. With the technology in 200 BC, it would be easier and faster to go the other way around, sail through the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic, But the only way that he could have come to America would be to sail northeast past Japan. There's the Kuroshiro Current, which I've spoken about in some other of these stories, and take advantage of the prevailing westerlies, which means you're going north into the westerly currents and westerly winds, So just like the Manila galleons did, in the 1500s through the 1800s, they went in a circular route from Manila, and they went north past Japan, and then came across the North Pacific and landed in the Oregon coast or Northern California, and then sailed south to Acapulco, which is almost to Ecuador. What if Satsuma Chen, his records were really true, and Hsu Fu wanted to find a fertile coastal plain where he could settle down with 3,000 young men and virgins to declare himself king, which is what they said he did. So he'd have to pass quite a few pretty good sites to get to Ecuador. The coast of Ecuador is certainly pleasant, but it's hardly paradise compared to some of the places he'd sail past. The coast of Northern California and Oregon is rocky and windswept and foggy, so they may not have suited the expedition. But how about Southern California, though? The weather was mild, the fish and game were abundant. The coastal plains extremely fertile for agriculture. The topsoil on the Ventura County coast along the Santa Paula River Valley is considered some of the best in the world. Something like 80% of the market vegetables in the U.S. is grown in that small area. I used to live up there, and they would turn the crops every 6 weeks. They'd grow different crops. Broccoli and whatever. Just a lot of different market vegetables, and then and they'd pick them every 6 weeks, turn the fields, and they'd run 6 or 8 crops a year. So, and it had plenty of water as well. That area had a river running through it. So, anyway, maybe he didn't bother because maybe the wide bay of Southern California he passed it up. Keep heading south. Outside the Channel Islands. So, it wouldn't be the mark of a wise seaman, but it's possible. Sailing south from Southern California, Hsu Fu would have come across Baja California. While there's plenty of sea life there, the absence of water makes it, pretty unwelcoming place. It's a parched desert, and, so it would make sense that he would pass that up. Once he passed Cabo San Lucas and sailed across the entrance to the Sea of Cortez towards the Mexican mainland, they'd encounter another hostile desert called Sinaloa, But if you went south from there, the environment changes pretty quickly. The sand and salt flats of Sinaloa are replaced by the tropical coastline of Nayarit, Jalisco, Michoacan, Colima, and Guerrero. These are very lush green places where farming is great. The weather's wonderful. It's a little hot and sticky for my taste, but it's still pretty nice. This is known as the Mexican Riviera. It's got fabulous resorts. Mazatlan, Manzanillo. Puerto Vallarta. These are we've got world famous sport fishing. A lot of tropical fruits and animals. But this would have been a great place for Hsu Fu to plant his flag. So. it would be hard to pass that up after having crossed 6,000 miles of ocean, you know, on a trip that must have taken 9 months at least at that time. So the only possible explanation is that he must have known where he was going. There were records of earlier voyages. There's evidence of regular trade 1,000 years before Hsu Fu could have been somehow discovered by him. So he trusted his advisor he was a trusted advisor to the Qin Emperor, you know, Hsu Fu, and the emperor conquered, you know, various warring states. So it's no stretch of logic to assume that he could have access to the libraries of the conquered lands. So, you know, there was a series of novels that were created quite a few years before that. Not novels; they were called the Classics of Mountains and Rivers, and it was really a giant atlas, a Chinese atlas that many of the volumes had disappeared over time. You know, it would be a miracle if they could ever put together where they went to, but. You know, if Hsu Fu had taken one and had maps and navigational instruments and a compass and the ability to determine his position at sea, he could have found that place on the coast of Ecuador, and he may have headed that way just because he knew it. He knew of it and decided to go. So there's a lot of possibility that Chinese discoverers came to Latin America, what we call Latin America now, many years before the modern times, and Hsu Fu in 219 BC may have just been one of them. So, based on the evidence, it keeps presenting itself. So. Anyway, that's the story of Hsu Fu, and hope that was interesting to you. And I've got quite a few more that I want to get into in the future of talking about some of these ancient voyages. Well, thank you for watching, and we'll talk to you again soon.